1, 2, 3.
Добрий день.
Good morning, my name is Olga Skrypnyk, and it's my pleasure to see everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform today. It's been 10 years of the war, and today's day is 762 of the full-scale invasion of our home led by Russian aggressor. And today we have invited you to talk about an important topic. The topic of today's press conference is stolen childhood, Russia's preparation of Ukrainian children for war amid occupation and deportation. So all of us are witnesses of Russia's systemic war crimes in temporarily occupied territories. Specifically, today we're talking about militarization of children who ended up in temporarily occupied territories now, or those who were forcibly deported, displaced to Belarus or Russian Federation. So this is how the Russians train the mobilization pool for the so-called Russian army, and our children, in fact, are being prepared for the war against Ukraine. We understand that it's all about systemic approach of the aggressor country, and it's not only those crimes that we witness confirm those facts, but even the legislation that the so-called Russia was preparing even before the full-scale invasion can be an evidence of that too. So let me introduce our speakers today. Joining us in our studio are Khrystyna Shkudor, where are our people campaign advocacy manager, PR Army NGO, Olga Skrypnyk, head of the board of the Crimean human rights group, Maria Sulyalina, head of the Center for Civil Education Almenda, and Vladyslav Gavrilov, research historian at the Where Are Our People PR Army NGO project. So good afternoon, everybody. Ms. Khrystyna, let me give the floor to you. Let's start with you. So what is about advocacy? What about the struggle to bring our children back home? Well, good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who has found time to attend this press conference dedicated to the forced deportation of Ukrainian children. And I have to say that talking about the scale in which the Ukrainian children are being deported and stolen were not witnessed by the world since the times of World War II, and nobody has a formula how to solve this issue in legal frameworks. So we are the flagmans. However, we wouldn't like to be flagmans in things like this, but unfortunately Ukraine is the first country who's looking for the solution of this issue, how to bring all the stolen children back home. Unfortunately, there is no unique formula for that. I have to disappoint everybody who was looking for an easy answer. There is no such formula, because bringing all of the deported people, both adults and children, is possible only under very specific conditions. If Ukraine wins in the battlefield, we will be able to bring all of the stolen people back home. So currently, we don't see this long-awaited victory, and we're looking for other methods. We understand that Russia deports all of the kids from newborns to 16 to 18 years old, and if the children are conscious, like if at the age of 11 plus they know who they are, for those who were newborn, for them 2 years, that the full-scale invasion is going on. It's a hell of a time, so they can get brainwashed and understand what they have to think about themselves. So to say, so my colleague Vladyslav knows more detail about those facts, and I can only share the advocacy success and a little bit of figures. So let me start with the figures. So according to the data from United Nations, Russia deported within the period of the full-scale invasion 2.8 million Ukrainians. Among those, we know the names of less than 20,000 children who were deported. 386 were returned to Ukraine from deportation. According to the data from the Commissioner for Children's Rights, the number of children who were deported is around 250,000. We don't know either their names or any other data because Russian Federation does not disclose any such data. Russian Federation itself claims to have more than 700,000 children deported, but where's the truth? We don't know, because since the moment a child is being taken from Ukraine and brought to Russian Federation, their birth certificate is being substituted and they become the citizens of Russian Federation. Then they are being adopted by Russian families, and since then finding such child is almost impossible. To find such children, we need to look through archives of Russian Federation that contain any information about the previous name of the child, their new name, and who was the adopting family. This is how we can track all the chain. Currently, we don't have such an opportunity, so unfortunately, currently we can only guess. At the same time, we don't know what are the conditions that the children are being kept in and what's happening to them in general. So I don't want to take a lot of your time. I would like to be brief. So talking about advocacy, this topic is incredibly complicated because keeping the deportation of Ukrainian children in focus, we have to keep the focus of global political leaders on Ukraine. And it's difficult because the full-scale invasion lasts more than 2 years now. Everybody's got their own problems. And global leaders very frequently forget about Ukraine. Ukraine leaves the headlines of the global media, and thus, I mean, many people in Europe or America, they keep asking me like, hasn't the war ended yet? So they are a little bit too far from the reality, which complicates the process of both advocacy and bringing back Ukrainian children to Ukraine, because such organizations as United Nations or Red Cross, they pay too little attention to the topic of Ukraine, including the topic of forcibly abducted Ukrainian children. And the best way of advocating for Ukraine is to keep Ukraine on agenda in global media. This is exactly what PR Army and where our People project are involved in. At least we try to do that. And there are certain success in this area. So the more the topic of Ukrainian deported children will be covered, the higher the probability of their bringing back home. But again, let me emphasize that we can only bring back all of them until the very last one after the victory in the battlefield. This is why within the framework of our advocacy efforts we urge to provide weapons to Ukraine, because that's the only way how all these children can be saved, because we understand that unfortunately Russian Federation does not recognize any court ruling, no matter what it is. And yet another leverage that we want to use with our colleagues from Build This Ukraine, we gather the petitions, the signatures for the petition to United Nations to assist in the return of the deported Ukrainian children. This petition is supposed to gather more than 100,000 votes until the 1st of June, and only then the United Nations will review that petition. I understand it sounds nonsensical to us, but this is how the things are. So I urge everybody who is watching us and listens to us, and if you can do it on your mass media, please help share this petition, because then it will be reviewed by the Organization of United Nations, and we hope that it would help to expedite the process of bringing Ukrainian children back home. It will be open to any and all of your questions after the press conference, but I don't want to take a lot of time, so let me pass the floor to my colleagues. Yes, right, thank you very much, Ms. Iryna. So let's talk about such topics as militarization of the kids, what's going on in the occupied territories. Good afternoon to everybody who is watching us online and offline. My name is Olga Skrypnyk. I'm the head of the board of the Crimean Human Rights Group. I want to thank, first of all, the armed forces of Ukraine, thanks to whom we can continue doing our job, and all the journalists who cover all those important topics. Our organization deals with the war crimes of Russian Federation since 2014, because it was back then when Crimea was occupied. In 2014, the military operation to seize Crimea has started, which resulted in a number of war crimes that now, due to the absence of the reaction of the international partners back in 2014, are currently multiplying in more territories, including the crimes committed against our children. And it was Crimea where Russia started building this children militarization system that we're discussing today. And Crimea has become a training ground, not only military training ground, but training ground for all other illegal practices like political persecutions, militarization, deportation, and stuff like that. Now we're observing it in newly occupied territories in bigger scale. So what Russia has done in Crimea, when we talk about militarization of the children, they are not just activities of the aggressor country. It's an international war crime, and Ukraine has taken enough efforts to corroborate the fact of crime. So today we're talking exclusively about such crime as propaganda of service in the Russian army among the kids. It's prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention because the occupied country has no right to do any such or conduct any such propaganda among the children. And if we view Crimea from the point of view of legal qualification, it's important to mention that this propaganda that is being spread over the kids within the last 10 years is a media for exercising or committing a war crime, which is forcing them to the service. It's not a propaganda itself, but it's done to make sure that children, as they achieve certain age, are conscripted with Russian army. So it's a form of forcing. When they create a reality for you where there is no other way than joining Russian army, it's still a forced conscription because they force you to do it. To what extent is it dangerous? We've researched all this system and we've handed over all of the evidences to International Criminal Court. We work together with the Prosecutor's office of the city of Sevastopol and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. That's our Ukrainian Prosecutor's office, which are currently based in Kiev, and they are one of the best law enforcement agencies who provide the best examples of the investigation in cooperation with civil organizations. We've gathered a number of examples. We were monitoring events that were going on in different establishments, and we've proved that it was the system created by Russian Federation for militarization of children to further on, and further on is the full-scale war against us, so that further on those children become the mobilization pool. And whether Russia achieved it or not, you may see in this list the events that are used to militarize the kids, and we understand that it's a systemic policy. It's totally overwhelming. So it starts with kindergartens and schools. This is where different events were implemented, and the platform for this, or the basis for this, were the programs of patriotic education in different shapes. So all of the programs which were related to the kids, they were one way or another related to so-called patriotic education. And the goal of patriotic education is just one and single: to create the reality for the children where they have to go and die for Russia. And as an example of this systemic policy and the evidence of the fact that there was a lot of budgets invested in it, back in year 2020, from the so-called Crimean budget, from that Crimean budget alone, on top of other financial programs in Russia, there were more than 22 million hryvnia allocated only for one youth program, not other program, just one youth program. And back then, from the so-called Crimean budget, they've allocated 22 million for a couple of years to take care of the youth. And the goal was one and only: to prepare the kids for the army. So I can talk on and on about the kindergartens and schools, but the most illustrative is the kindergarten number 36. There are more kindergartens where such patriotic education activities are implemented, because in school that's absolutely total, that's a daily thing within the extracurricular or daily program, including the presence of the war criminals, Russian mercenaries, or so-called volunteers who were killing Ukrainians or who keep killing Ukrainians, including civilians in newly occupied territories and other temporarily occupied territories. So they are invited to school as heroes, and they talk to the kids aged from 4+, and they talk to them how wonderful it is to kill the hohols. I'm quoting actually one of the events that was going on in Simferopol. So you understand, 4, 5, 6 years is preschool age, and this kindergarten number 36, they went way further. They've opened the cadet classes so that children get prepared to the army as soon as they are being born. So that's one of the examples that we were documenting as the proof of this, as an evidence of this crime. My colleagues from Almenda, they study a lot of summer camps, and those summer camps, they've become famous after the events of the year 22, when the children under the premises of evacuation from Kherson or Zaporizhia regions or Mariupol, you remember there were a lot of kids evacuated as if to the summer camps. So those camps, they have nothing in common with health and help to those children. That's yet another shape of forcing those, or form of forcing those kids to serve in the Russian army and to eradicate their Ukrainian identity. Then all of the parties of Russia, political parties like Russia United, they are all involved in militarization of children. However, the Russian legislation prohibits them to do so in schools, but they still keep doing it. Another example that would not be surprising for us, but still it's important to mention it: Russian Orthodox Church. We know that it's a tool of FSB one way or another, but still, all of the religious activities that were taking place under the control of occupational authorities, even on the level of religion, they were aimed at militarization of the kids. It's like blessing of the missiles that bomb us. I've picked yet another example, you know, something really touching. The summer camp of the community of Orthodox reconnaissance personnel. So it's like under religious premises summer camp where children are being taken and trained as a reconnaissance personnel. It doesn't fit in your head, but it's a documented example of this. Then another large-scale movements such as Youth Army, they state clearly that they train kids. The Crimean Patriotic Center, one of the so-called civil centers that prepare kids for the army. Among them, there is the voluntary community to assist Army, Navy, and Air Force. You remember that was the Soviet DOSAV back in the day, and they assist to all those organizations, imposing all those propaganda narratives on the children since school. And above all, the Ministry of so-called Education and Science of Crimea, who are responsible for organization of this propaganda. So basically they are the criminals too, because they are involved in perpetrating of war crime. Another thing is the Ministry of sports and youth of Russian Federation, there is the calendar plan of activities that are supposed to be conducted with the kids. So imagine it like there is propaganda in school, then there is propaganda in church, in religion, then there is propaganda in summer camp, so there is extracurricular propaganda every day, everywhere. You walk out in the street and there are Russian tanks over there. Sometimes you can see the sports which impose the Russian ideology about the great Russian army, what is it, second to somebody. And above all is the Ministry of Defense of Russia, because so-called education system in the occupied territories has nothing in common with education. It's not about education, it's not about right to education, it's not about protection of children, it's the tool of militarization and training of children for the army. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation has a number of orders in which they clearly describe what are the activities that should be conducted at school. So basically, Ministry of Defense tells everybody what's supposed to be done with the kids. And one of the most recent, the freshest examples, the so-called textbook that was issued recently in Moscow. Thanks to BBC, we were able to get familiarized with it, at least in part. Why in part? Because reading more than 300 pages of total misinformation of propaganda is quite an onerous task. And why am I paying attention to this textbook? Just a month ago, BBC has gotten a specimen that we've studied together with our colleagues, the experts and historians. Basically, you can read more about it in BBC material, so-called Cocktail, the Blood of Moscow. This is what the children are being intimidated from this, or in this textbook. So this textbook is more than 300 pages thick, and in that textbook there is already the list of documents the children need to submit to join the Russian armed forces. So they write very clearly, it's not about education, it's about having children join the army. And this textbook was printed in occupied territories. In first thing, the Russians bring it to temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, because Russia has recognized it recently that it's not so-called special military operation, but it's a war. They recognize themselves that they're waging a long-standing war with us, and they need this human resource, unfortunately. And they will draw these human resources from our occupied territories, from our children's pool. So it's a huge international war crime that the perpetrators should be accountable for. But it's not about stopping the perpetration of the crime. It's about our children dying as a part of Russian army, which is horrible. So no matter where we are, no matter what our foreign platforms that we attend, no matter our ties, but we have to keep talking everywhere and all the time. Why do we need weapons? Why is it impossible to protect children's rights and human rights without those weapons? We don't need it for war. We need the weapons to protect our children, to protect our people from the most terrible crimes in the human history that are happening now in Ukraine. So please use all of your opportunities, explain why we need weapons. And given the circumstances on international level, it's difficult, but without it, we won't be able to protect our people, including our children. Thank you, Olga. Maria, from what we've heard, from what Olga is saying, I mean, it's terrifying. I cannot wrap my head around it, given the scale of Russian propaganda for the time being. So can we talk about some specific cases? We've already heard about a number of them, specifically talking about those cases related to the territories that were occupied back in 2014. We've seen the examples when our children joined the ranks of the Russian army. So how is it practically happening? Thank you very much. My name is Maria. I'm the head of the Center for Civil Education, Almenda. I could ask to put the presentation of this on the screen. So our organization documents the crimes against children since 2014, and it's important for us to emphasize that we're talking about the systemic policy that is being implemented by Russian Federation and occupational administration against our children that ended up in occupied territories. Unfortunately, currently, we're saying that there are more than 1.5 million children living in occupied territories, including 615,000 children of school age. Why do we segregate them as a separate category? Because, as Olga has mentioned, children who are supposed to go to school, and they really must go to school, they have no choice in temporarily occupied territories. They become the victims of the system of eradication of Ukrainian identity, together with indoctrination. And at the same time, we keep emphasizing the role of youth movements, specifically patriotic movements such as Youth Army and UN First. And within the 10 years, Russian Federation was able to recruit a huge number of our children in those patriotic movements. If we see breakdown by statistics, we see that Crimean Peninsula is definitely a leader in number of children, but the reason is that Crimean Peninsula has been under occupation within 10 years, and children will live in that system for 10 years. So if we check those figures back in 2015-2016, we would have the numbers similar to those in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. So unfortunately, we have to state that the time works against our children, and the activities that should, or the actions that should be taken by Ukraine or global community, they are needed here and now, so that in 2 or 3 years we wouldn't be able to talk about the increase of the number of children who joined those movements in newly occupied territories, because so far Russia still feels impunity. The children are still being recruited, and the system after the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022 has only reinforced. Talking about specific examples, one of the brightest examples are the cadet classes functioning in schools. They work under the aegis of different services, for example, Investigations Committee of Russian Federation, and in those classes, children study from the first grade, basically very small kids who wear Russian military uniform, the uniforms of different Russian agencies and services, and they study the military training. So basically from the first grade, children are being trained to wage the war against their native country. They are being taught to perceive Russian Federation as their motherland, and we have to state about these dynamics again. And talking about dynamics, I'm not only talking about kids and figures. We're talking about very specific people who are responsible for implementation of this system, about the great teachers, school directors. It's about holding them accountable and prevent the opening of these patriotic classes in newly occupied territories, of Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, because without understanding of accountability for this violation, more and more people will be getting involved in this system. And for us, it's important to protect our kids, and we have to take all reasonable efforts to prevent this dynamic. And when we talk about education, we're saying that there is a very intense branched out network of militarization of our children. Those pictures, they illustrate what's going on with the education system in temporarily occupied territories, in different parts of them. Our organization with our colleagues analyzed the textbooks our children in temporarily occupied territories study by. You can get familiarized with the results of our study on our website, and we see those narratives circulating when from the basic school children are being taught that they need to defend Russian Federation, that the most important of their duties is to take up the arms to defend their homeland. We see the heroization and glorification of the war, glorification of war in historical retrospective. We see a very important narrative of the winner country, which is victorious and who needs to continue being victorious. And we see the juxtaposition of notions. And basically, the education is supposed to assist the sustainable development, as a sustainable peace. And what we see in occupied territories is very far from sustainable development and sustainable peace. It's a propaganda of war, it's propaganda of service with the armed forces of Russian Federation. And it's a huge influence over the identity of our children, and those children, in fact, they already need our help, and they need the programs for rehabilitation, because when you are under this system 2 years, just like in case of the newly occupied territories, or 10 years, as it is in the case of Crimea and those territories occupied from the very beginning of the war, it's obvious that your consciousness will be changing, and you will need specific programs to train you to live in a democratic society, because what Russian Federation prepares you to, they prepare the universal soldiers whom they can get conscripted to the war that they are waging, and this is exactly what they do to our citizens in occupied territories who achieve the age of 18. And in the same way, they prepare them to the wars to come. So currently in the schools, we see not only the so-called heroes who are at the war now, but the heroes of Chechen wars, of Syrian wars, and all those military. They come to the children and they tell them how important it is to take part in the war, how glorifying it is. So it's the basic context that our children live in for the time being. Secondly, it's about the policies of Russian Federation, and thirdly, it's about the responsible for perpetrators. Because when we talk about what's going on with our children in occupied territories, we have to understand who is aggressor and who is the victim. Because even those children who succumb to that propaganda, who put on the military uniforms, they are the victims of this system. And there are very specific adults who very clearly understand what they do to our kids and who are supposed to be held accountable for the crimes they perpetrate. On top of that, Olga has already mentioned the summer camps. And the system of military patriotic camps is so branched out in occupied Crimea. I think Vladyslav may tell in better detail about those camps in occupied Crimea and Russian Federation. So they train practical skills. For example, in school, the children are being taught how to handle the weapons, for example, but the camps, in their essence, they provide the children with very practical skills to make sure that after those children achieve the conscription age, they can be sent to the front lines, and this is exactly what they are being prepared for. I was saying multiple times that it's important for us to stop this system, and the scale this network is spread is only the result of the fact that there was no sanction pressure of those people who were responsible for spreading this network. The absence of any proper reaction. For example, in the last sanction package of the European Union, to which we've submitted our suggestions to, many heads of these patriotic education organizations were included in those sanction lists. But we're just in the beginning of our path, because over those heads in the local governments, there are specific directors, there are other heads of the ministries who are supposed to be sanctioned, who are supposed to be held accountable. There are school teachers in those cadet classes that are supposed to be held liable and reinstatement of justice is very important for the people who ended up in occupation. And on top of that, our organization thinks that we have to view this story in the broader context of eradication of identity, because if we review the violations of the children's rights during the armed conflict, still there is no such violation included as eradication of identity, and we should add it because unfortunately it's not only Ukrainian context, it's the context of other wars, other armed conflicts all around the globe where children become victims of armed conflicts, and this violation should be segregated and identified as it is, as the eradication of identity. Us, as Ukraine, as a state, we have to work on reintegration approaches, reintegration policies, because we have to be ready to help those kids to readapt and return to democratic society, because they are our citizens, they are our kids, and it's not their fault that they ended up in occupation and they spent more than 10 years in this system. So as a society, now we have to work with those who are in our education system, those who enter our higher educational institutions, to help them become again a part of Ukrainian society, to overcome those barriers they have. And in the same way, we have to prepare the Ukrainian society to accept those children. We understand we will have conflicts inside our society, but for us, for Ukraine, it's really important to support each other and to forward our energy for reinstatement of justice and to holding accountable of those who are guilty of implementing this system. Vladyslav, when I look at those pictures that Maria has demonstrated, I think that there are some historical parallels being drawn in our heads, and we understand what we relate to the things that are happening in Russia. I know you've studied this issue, so please, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Yes, really, this practice is nothing new, and the practice of militarization of kids in the armed conflicts, in mass wars, is nothing new either. Specifically on this slide, we can see a picture of a practical conscription. Those are the youth army in temporarily occupied Mariupol, the Ukrainian children dressed in the uniforms and standing in line with Russian military. And as we look at this picture, there is a parallel with another picture where we can see Joseph Goebbels, who is awarding a Hitler-Jugend personnel for one of the victories, and Putin shaking a hand of youth army soldier. Those are very similar practice, because if we check out that youth army that was created in 2016, and currently, according to the data from their website, there are more than 1,300,000 children in their ranks, aged from 7 to 16 years. So we start having questions to Hitler-Jugend that was established in 1936. There were a couple thousand children in the beginning, and by the end of the war there were more than 8 million, almost 9 million, and we know there was a 12-tank armored division that was made up of the graduates of Hitler-Jugend who were waging a war against the Allied forces. So basically those were kids of 17 years old. The age census was reduced by the Nazi Germany, and those children could be involved in military operations. In the same way, Putin sees his goal. It's quite visible in involvement of children in conflict, those who are part of youth army. How is it visible? Because they have the so-called boot camps where they bring kids from occupied territories of Ukraine in those youth army units which are currently in temporarily occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkov, Donetsk, Crimea, and from there we can see videos and pictures, the evidences of the so-called military patriotic training going on. And in the same way, they want to have those children in a year 2 or 3 engaged in the war against Ukraine, so they take just as active part in that war as the Hitler-Jugend personnel was taken in the war against the Allied forces. Another practical example that I wanted to demonstrate, this young boy, Anatoly Yashko, he's taken a pseudonym Orlov. He's a former youth army, born in Donetsk, temporarily occupied Donetsk. In 2018, there was a youth army unit there, youth army of Donetsk. He's grown up there, and currently he's a part of Russian occupation forces, and he is in the ranks of occupational forces fighting against Ukraine. On one hand, he's wearing a beret of youth army. On other picture, he's wearing a uniform and he's sporting his occupier's logo on his shoulder patch. And I would like to say that the war criminals, they are still can be held accountable and be punished for their crimes, at least on the level of international sanctions. And we've submitted the people who were involved in process of forced militarization to the sanction list, both in occupied territories of Ukraine and territory of Russian Federation. Those pictures, they contain Volodymyr Kovalenko from Youth Army Crimea, Zamit Chalaev. He works in Russian Federation in the Republic of Chechnya. There is a military educational institution where the children from occupied Donetsk and Luhansk are being brought to, and there they are being subject to militarization process. Also, I would like to mention in brief about the camps in Russian Federation, so how the militarization in occupied territories is going on with involvement of movement of the first, Young Guard, Youth Army, and in the same way the deported children are being militarized, those who were deported to Russian Federation, and there this militarization is going on in the units of Youth Army who were dispersed all across Russian Federation. And there is also such organization that was previously called Wagner Boy, and after Prigozhin's assassination it's called Leader Club. They educate the patriotic spirit of the Russian children over there too, but they get Ukrainian deported children involved in those practices too. So those paramilitary camps of Wimpel organization, one of the most interesting but the most criminal examples, because Wimpel was created by special forces of Russian Federation who were taking part in operations in Chechnya. Previously, they were taking part in Afghanistan campaign of Soviet Union, and currently they tried to sow those misinformation seeds in the soil of deported Ukrainian kids to train them into the future Russian military, in fact. So that's all happening in Russian Federation for the time being. And even talking about this club Wimpel, they have more than 100 such camps, talking about the temporary stationing locations where Ukrainian deported kids may be staying. Even according to information from Russian Federation, there are more than 800 such stations. They close and reopen, they relocate, but they are being established on a permanent basis. The mass deportations are still going on, but we have to remember that deportation is not even the final result of this process. The final result is to leave Ukrainian kids in Russian Federation, creation of artificial demographic crisis, re-education of Ukrainian children, and preparation of future mobilization pool for Russian army, and at the same time eradication of Ukrainian identity, the same as my colleagues emphasize and the same as we emphasize in our organization, because that's the fact. And today I would also like to emphasize that we commemorate the mass deportation from the Baltic countries. The Operation Ebb was going on from 25th to 28th of March, and more than 90,000 citizens of Baltic countries were deported to Tomsk in Irkutsk regions, and those people were not able to come back home until the 60s, 70s of the 20th century, and as a result they were forced to study in Soviet schools, and after their return many of them unfortunately were not able to recall the identity, the language, the country they were born and raised in. And as a historian, I see the same parallel. Russia, taking into account this KGB experience, they commit the same type of crime, trying to eradicate the identity of modern Ukrainian kids. This is why we have to urge all of the international community. We have to prevent those facts. We have to hold the perpetrators accountable, and using the foreign sanctions, and probably seek the warrants for the arrest of such war criminals. Okay, so right away the question about the international law, international humanitarian law. Are there cases, or is there a practice under which we can hold them accountable? Are there successful cases for bringing such people to liability? Well, let me tell you about the number of ways. We have successful examples. For example, in case of International Criminal Court, you know, for example, the arrest warrant for Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, the children's commissioner. But on top of that, there is another face of this crime, is failure to return those kids. They were not only abducted, but they refused to return them. The colleague mentioned the number, like a little bit more than 300 kids were returned, which is an evidence of the fact that Russia doesn't want to bring them back. That's yet another crime. But we have this warrant, this ruling of International Criminal Court, and I think that the crimes against children is probably one of the priorities of International Criminal Court. And here I would like to emphasize that it's important to hold accountable everybody, including those who are responsible for creation of this and implementation of this system of militarization. But again, the first crime is the crime of aggression that was perpetrated back in 2014, and Russia cannot be punished for that, cannot be held accountable, because there are no mechanisms identified for this. Ukraine and other countries, they advocate for establishment of such mechanism to bring Russia accountable for the crime itself. And the things that we're talking about now, all those crimes perpetrated against the kids, they are the result of that first basic fundamental crime of aggression. So in our organization, we deal a lot with inciting hatred and the hate speech. In Crimea, it happens in relation to Crimean Tatars, and now we have all grounds to state that Russia switched to a whole different level. It's not about hate speech, but it's about an international crime. It's inciting of genocide. It's like not genocide itself, but it's inciting of genocide. And among those, I don't know how to call those talking heads correctly. You cannot call them journalists, because they are no journalists. They do not represent their profession. They are propagandists who urge to kill the civilians, to destroy the civilian infrastructure, and they call to crimes against children. You can find horrible videos where they justify killing of children, the murder of children. They say it's normal because they are Ukrainians, right? So it's not propaganda only. It's international crime, inciting of genocide. And in the context of children, it's important to have this real mechanism to hold Russian propagandists accountable, because it's them who created this motivation of crimes, when even the children can be killed if they are Ukrainians. This is why if international community does not become more courageous, does not start developing and implementing new mechanism to bring Russian propagandists to liability, those terrible crimes will continue repeating themselves, not only in the context of war against Ukraine, but it will be possible anywhere we see the armed conflicts erupting and intensifying in different regions of the earth, and children will suffer. The tools that Russia uses, they work everywhere where there is war. So we have to switch to more active stance, and we urge everybody to review the tool of accountability of Russian propagandists, given the fact that certain fraction of them left Russia and they feel great in other countries where they continue creating new content that works against those countries where they're staying. We see a lot of political processes going on in the countries that are close to us that can change the situation dramatically, like political movements that support Ukraine or those who support Russia, anti-Ukrainian rhetorics. So that's not something that we're making up. It already exists. Certain fraction of Russian propagandists, they help creating that propaganda picture for European or even American spectators who start believing it. But again, us as Ukrainians, we are the most responsible and we have to do the most complicated job. We have to investigate all the crimes. We cannot say that ICC would come and solve all of our problems. That's never gonna happen. Even the ICC, they've identified a number of cases they will undertake, but even given their mandate and the number of crimes, they won't be capable of investigation of all of the crimes. But we have to do it, because other than us, nobody cares that much. So we have to seek the transparency of all of our agencies. We have to seek the court reform. We have to avoid the suppression of civil society, because there are bad signs here already in this area. Why am I talking about ICC? Because it was prepared by the Prosecutor's office and civil organizations. And talking about Crimea, all of the communications with the ICC were prepared with input of civil society. It's clear that it's a basis for investigation, and it's human rights organizations and local initiatives who can provide the evidences of what should be investigated. And for us as the citizens, we have to continue being vigilant to prevent any limitations imposed on civil society, because back in 2014 it was only the civil society who sought the investigation of those crimes committed in Russia, which are currently being reviewed by international courts. So there's a lot of responsibility on us to make it happen. So working together will be important, and we have to understand that the major part of the crimes will be investigated by our national court system. If I may add a little bit, in our opinion, we also see the potential to hold the perpetrators accountable for crime against humanity, because we see what's going on with the kids, with eradication of their identity. It can be qualified as this type of crime. It takes a lot of efforts to provide evidences to this crime, but we see that within these 2 years of full-scale invasion, the topic of eradicating of Ukrainian identity, the topic of indoctrination started popping up in the opinions of international organizations, like the description of Moscow mechanisms, the reports of the United Nations, and we will be able to demonstrate thus the systemic nature of what was done to our kids, and to hold the top-level government officials who are responsible for implementation of this system accountable. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If we have any questions on the floor, you are kindly invited to join our conversation. Fakti, Vladimir Savchuk. Question probably to you, Mrs. Khrystyna. Can you please tell us, out of 20,000 children whose names you were able to identify, probably the majority of them, they have relatives, right? But why in the majority of cases, even in presence of the relatives, we still cannot bring all of the children back home, and we were able to bring back only a bit more than 300? Well, it's simple and complicated at the same time. Russia just doesn't want to give them back. They do everything to complicate the process. For example, a child may have a grandfather or a grandmother in the Ukrainian controlled territory. They force the grandparents to go. You understand, you cannot go to Russia from Ukraine, so they force them to go to Russian Federation through Europe. They're supposed to provide DNA sampling. You cannot bring a DNA sample from Ukraine. You have to do the DNA sampling in the Russian laboratory. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes two. So you understand that our pensioners, well, they don't even have such money. So I mean, talking about like regular simple things. They physically have no money for that. That's just one issue. Another problem, they cannot find their kids. We know their name, but where are they? Where? Like, Russian Federation is the biggest country in the world, with the biggest territory. So there are cases when children were brought back, well, out of those 386, but the vast majority of them, there were conscious kids who were able to find a phone, who were remembering the phone number. They gave a call to their family members, or maybe they texted it to their family members through the social networks. I cannot disclose all the ways, because the Russian propaganda, their special services, you know, they listen to us, and then they will cut those ways for Ukrainian kids. And they just told their family members where they are. So they've basically found a way to take the child from Russian Federation. But if a child is 2 years old, how are they supposed to find a phone, to remember the number, to give a call to their relatives, and to let them know where are they? And again, what I've mentioned at the very beginning, their birth certificates are being substituted. You know, we're just back from a journey, from a trip to America, from New York and Washington. We were there with 3 deported kids from Mariupol who were brought back from captivity, and the only way they returned, we were able to bring them back from Donetsk, from the hospital, but they were calling to the people who were working in those hospitals, and their grandparents were calling to those children, to those people working in those hospitals, so they hold their children there and they don't get deported. So it's difficult. It's really difficult to bring children back from Russia. It's difficult to bring them back from occupied territories, but it's still less difficult than bringing them back from Russian Federation. I'm not a lawyer myself. I mean, the lawyers can explain you all the details, but it's about the secret of adoption. It's about substituted birth certificates. So basically, we don't even know who those kids are. There was a huge scandal when one of the top-level government officials adopted a girl from Mariupol, and there were her relatives found in Ukraine. So they recognized their child. But how can we bring her back home? Russia just doesn't want to give her back. You see, so there is like a question, like any legislation is being neglected by Russian Federation. In Russian Federation, they have a law adopted by their parliament, Duma, that they can legally act in disaccord with any ruling of the court or any foreign legislation. Like, what is the way to bring those children back other than forcibly? Like, well, like we say, okay, there is an arrest warrant for Putin and Lvova below, but what can we do about it? We have more questions on the floor. Good afternoon. Can you please tell us what are the international institutions that are involved in this process of bringing back Ukrainian kids back home, and were there cases when you were able to get in touch with the child and either the child or their foster parents refused to come back to Ukraine? Well, I'm popular today, so yes, there were different cases. but I don't know about any cases when children would have refused to come back to Ukraine, or their foster parents would refuse to take them back to Ukraine from Russia. Well, I'm not talking here about the deported children. I'll try to give you more detail on that later. Well, talking about international organizations, we're trying to force them to action, not only to concern, but to action. We're trying to involve Builders Ukraine. This is an American association of pro-Ukrainian organizations, so this is like an umbrella organization under which they gather a lot of other pro-Ukrainian organizations. So we've created a petition to the United Nations to urge them to bring Ukrainian children back home. United Nations are entitled not to review this petition, which they can do if the petition does not reach 100,000 signatures. This is why we urge everybody to sign this petition, because United Nations may say like, we're not gonna do it and that's it. Well, because basically it's them who can do this. It's them or Red Cross. Well, the Red Cross and United Nations organization are two international organizations who still work in Russian Federation, who still could do this. And why don't they do this? Well, you should probably ask them rather than me. But in fact, they still don't do this. A couple of kids were returned recently with the mediation of Qatar. It's not an international organization, it's a country, but in fact they assisted to returning Ukrainian kids back home. But those are single cases. It's not like a mass return of Ukrainian deported kids. The biggest pain is that Russian Federation refuses to talk about orphans. If they still can talk about children, for example, whose parents were killed in Mariupol, well, they still can talk about those children, but talking about orphans, they totally refuse to talk about orphans. If, for example, the parents were deprived of parents' rights, there is nobody to advocate for them. This is why I do this. I talk to United Nations, to diplomats in their halls, in their rooms. I talk to American diplomats, and I'm saying there is nobody to fight for those kids. But Russians, they refuse to talk about them at all. I think Vlad may add something. Yes, I would like to add to describe the scale of difficulty of return. Why is it so difficult to return the kids? To understand this, you have to understand who is involved in this process. For example, Maria Lvova Belova, in whose name there is international arrest warrant issued by ICC. So she was meeting a plane in Moscow region with the governor of Moscow region, Andrei Vorobyov, who is under international sanctions. So they were meeting the children from occupied Donetsk region, and they were accommodating them in the educational institutions of Moscow region. With the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the practice that existed since 2014, our colleagues from Crimea know those trains of hope when they were deporting children to Rostov region, and after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they were bringing children to Rostov, Voronezh, and Kursk regions, accommodating them in the summer camps. Then the scale has grown. We find locations in Primorsky district, it's 35 kilometers to Vladivostok. It's closer for them to swim to Japan rather than to return to Ukraine. And the governor of Primorsky Krai is involved in this process too, Oleg Kozymak, and he funds keeping them in summer camps. There is such a summer camp called Ocean. It can accept more than 1,000 kids. So they bring Ukrainian children over there, and then they say like, we evacuated them. We did not deport them, but we evacuated them. And it's difficult to prove it, because if you evacuate them, us as a Ukrainian society, we want to bring them back home. But they don't let them bring back home. First of all, they don't provide the list, they don't provide any details about the children. So why do we say we don't know who exactly of those children were deported? Because we just don't get the lists. In those summer camps, they mix Ukrainian and Russian children, they submit them as joint lists, and it's difficult to discern who is from the so-called temporarily occupied territory and who came for recreation from so-called Russian Federation. Yet another example, the governor of Murmansk region, Andrei Chibis, he's undertaken an aegis over the Primorsky district of Zaporozhye region. We found the pictures. The so-called commissioner for education of Murmansk region came there, and they came there meeting Ukrainian kids. They've taken Ukrainian kids and brought them to Murmansk region. It borders on Norway, and there were reports in Norway media that the Ukrainian kids were brought to Murmansk region for recreation. But who are those kids? It's like there was a governor who came to Zaporizhzhia region and abducted a number of Ukrainian kids. So the top-level government officials are involved in this process. This is why it's difficult to identify those kids and to bring them back home. This is why we need the international support, the support of the coalition, international coalition, because the Ukrainians by themselves probably, for Ukrainians themselves, it will be difficult to make it. Thank you very much, dear speakers, for this important event. Thank you for what you're doing. I want to thank the representatives of the mass media for the interest in this topic, and we continue working together for our victory. I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can continue holding events like this. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.